And share. Just give it till 10:03. Okay. So thanks for everyone who is in here today. If you do have questions, please ask it in the chat. Use the button to raise your hand, or put your hand up in the if you're being shown. We're going to talk about international business, quickly why companies would do that, and just a little bit of a review of production from last week. So here is our Kahoot from last week. So just some of the production. So production factors, what do they not include? Materials, capital, management, inventory. So, I might have messed that one up. I think when I was doing this, I meant to say that inventory was the correct one. So inventory isn't one of the production factors. I'll change that the next time I do that, but I apologize for that one. It actually, management, the oversight of a factory is one of our production factors. So sorry about that little mistake there. So the production process doesn't include purchasing, processing, grading, or cleaning. Yeah, so it doesn't include, there's a cleaning, that could be part of quality control, but the other, it's just use the key terms, and the terms in the book are purchasing, processing, grading, and quality control is the fourth step. So when something goes missing or it's damaged, it's known as depreciation, quality control, inventory shrinkage, or just life. So yeah, so that again, that's a little bit of a terminology. We're talking about maybe at a grocery store, if food goes bad, if something goes missing because it's in a big warehouse, just if it's filed in the wrong place, and the term for that would be inventory shrinkage. Just there's always a little 1 or 2% of the inventory that always goes missing, and that's called inventory shrinkage. So when workers are trained to learn another station within the factory, it's known as initial training, ongoing, retraining, or specialized. Sometimes, they're working at one station, in the automotive plant, they're putting on car doors, and then they have to go, work on, putting the windshield on, so they would be retrained. Over the next 3 years, the biggest threat to jobs could be globalization, automation, retraining. So globalization is a concern because jobs might leave North America for a place where the wages are cheaper, but actually what's the biggest threat is that many of these jobs can easily be automated by a machine that does it as well or better. So what's the term when raw materials and intermediate goods arrive just when they're needed? And that would be a trend in, for things to arrive just at the moment that they're needed. So how can we increase productivity? There's two answers here. Right, you can put more money, buy a new machine that's more efficient. You can retrain people so they do a better job. Those would be two ways to become more productive. So, okay, so um, congratulations to Hannah there. Do you guys have any questions about the production from last week? Okay, you can put that in the chat window, and then I can see it when you type it in. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit more about international business this week. To just start things off, I wanted to talk about a bit of a case study. So the idea with case studies is that um, we learn what went well or what didn't go well in a real life situation, and that way you can avoid those mistakes. So I'm just going to make sure I'm sharing my screen. So one of a good example of a recent case study of something successful would be McDonald's when they went to India. So they spent about 3 to 4 years planning this, and as a result of that, it was very successful. Sometimes, businesses, if they rush, they might trip over something or they might forget something. So by looking at McDonald's, you can see, what can help others companies succeed internationally. So what sort of McDonald's does is they use what's called a multi-domestic strategy, meaning each country they treat differently. So they don't treat the United States the same way that they treat China, or the same way that they would treat India, or the same way they would treat France. There's going to be some differences in each country, and that's one way that they've been successful. They still keep those same golden arches, some of the same menu items, but they make little changes. So they first began to planning in the early 90s, and then they launched it in India in 1996, but not before making adjustments to their formula. And so you can see a McDonald's in India. So what were some of the problems? Well, India loses $9.1 billion annually to food spoilage. That'd be an example of shrinkage. It's very warm, The roads are not especially reliable, so sometimes there's breakdowns as there's breakdowns, oops, as the food, food is being transported. And so that was an issue, right? You can't have the meat go bad or, produce go bad in a restaurant business. So what did they do? Well, as part of planning ahead, they found local sources for all of their products that were in the area of the restaurant. So rather than having one central location, they partnered with, farmers throughout the country. They used cold chain management. So if you see in this little image here, there's some people, they're in the warehouse, they're wearing their coats, hats, it's all cold. The food never warms up, it never gets to room temperature. It's always cold throughout the process. And they do quality checks during the transport. So periodically they'll pause, check the quality of the food, and so they spent about 80 million upfront to avoid having some of their food go bad and cause people to be sick or cause some embarrassment. So planning ahead logistically avoided that issue. So and there you can see the supply, the cold chain, like it's the trucks, the factories, they're all cold the whole time. What else did they do? Well, apparently, and you wouldn't know this unless you planned ahead, Indian potatoes have a higher moisture content, about 85%, which soaks up too much oil and it doesn't fry the way that McDonald's wants them to. So it made the fries lumpy. So they had to improve the local potatoes. So they sent some agronomists to India to study the conditions. They sent new saplings to the Lahore region and, picked that region because it had low precipitation, and they taught the farmers how to, grow potatoes the way that they are expected to make McDonald's fries. And that, was an example of logistics. You can't just assume everything will be the same. They had to go and study the environmental conditions to make sure the potatoes were appropriate. And there you can see some of the local potatoes that they grew in the Lahore region. What else? Well, you can't have drive-throughs in India, and that's something that's very much associated with McDonald's. So what's the alternative? Well, they had home delivery. And here you can see in the right, some scooters that they had to get. So rather than build out the big drive-through window, they bought a bunch of scooters. And again, that's a type of adjustment that they made. Roads are hard to navigate. So they spent 6 years setting up their food supply. And again, they found local partners. One of the key things about international business is if you can find a good local partner, it saves making the mistakes that you might make if you rushed or you didn't know all the conditions. So that's one of the issues that they had. Now you can see, rather than drive through, they made home delivery on these scooters, which fit the streets of the cities a lot better. Pricing. It was seen as a really expensive restaurant. So they, rather than being an everyday restaurant, they made themselves a family restaurant, and they advertised themselves as a place for a special occasion. So rather than say, hey, stop 2 to 3 times a week at McDonald's, they say, hey, when you need to do something to celebrate, come by once a week, once a month. And then they encourage people to come more often. And for whatever reason, the Happy Meals were very popular. So they really pushed those in their advertisement. Even among people who weren't children, it was very popular. Just, to have a Happy Meal for whatever reason. So that was a big part of their promotion. You can see a bit of the menu. You can see also there's some different menu items here. There's no beef, right? There's some paneer wraps. There's a Maharaja mac. There's fish. There's chicken. So obviously they had to adjust it kind of looks the same as a McDonald's sandwich, but they had some extra, modifications. So beef's not consumed in India. They had to adapt the recipe, eggless mayonnaise, vegetable oil only, adding new menu items. So they can't just serve everything that they would in North America. So they modified it, and they modify their items throughout the world. Uh, Now they operate about 350, and they have about 300 million customers. They're trying to grow by 100% over the next few years in the South. And they're also opening McCafes to attract a younger crowd. So that's their plan for the future. And you can see a McCafe, looks a little different than the McDonald's, we saw at the start of the little Prezi. So um, you can see my resources if you go back there. So that's kind of the reason that I show you that is it sounded like a good idea. There's a billion customers there, but it couldn't just be done in theory. They had to make some modifications, and those are the types of modifications any company would have to do to succeed in a new country. So that's sort of the reason we lead with that, to sort of say, hey, look, you got to understand international business, there's a lot more customers, but it can be more complicated. Are there any sort of questions about McDonald's or the idea of studying case studies for this? Okay. So I'm going to move on and focus on just the reasons that companies will expand internationally. If you take the e-learning course, um, if you take the BBB 4M course, you would obviously do this in a little more detail, but pretty much why would a company want to expand overseas? And this is sort of some of the reasons. So why would a company look to go beyond Canada? Well, there's a few reasons. If you wanted to watch about a bit about Brexit when you have more time, there's a short video there. But Canada, there's about 30 million people in the world. Sorry, 30 million people in Canada. And then there's 6 billion in the world. So by doing business internationally, you can get access to a market 200 times the size. Our largest partner is the US, and they're 10 times the size. So if you've succeeded in Canada and you've done all you can in Canada, well, there's a neighbor next door that offers about, the chance to grow 10 times and be more successful. So you can watch that video about what Canada and the US trade. So pretty much this is one of the takeaway slides for today. What are the benefits to business? Well, you get access to markets. You get access to those extra customers. You get access to those American customers or those global customers. So more potential customers, more potential sales. You get access to cheaper labor. So there are certain expectations for wages in Canada. There's a minimum wage. Other parts of the world, it's not as high. So sometimes companies that produce things, they'll go to an export processing zone in Asia, and they'll produce it there where it's a lot cheaper. You can find increased quality of goods. A lot of electronics are made in South Korea where there's good factories, there's trained workers, there's automation. It's set up to make very high quality electronics. And you can also, make more, right? You're not limited to the factories and the warehouses and the workers in Canada. You have everything that's available in the whole world. And sometimes there might be something like, a natural resource, from a certain part of the world. And, by working internationally, you get access to all of that. So there's some, in Hong Kong, some people lining up for iPhones. So when Apple works in Hong Kong, they get access to that market. So basically, access to markets means, there's more possible partners, there's more customers, there's more governments, it's a good way to expand the business. So one term that's in the little worksheet. So domestic market would be the local market. So for a Canadian company, if they were operating out of Toronto, the domestic market would be Canada. That'd be the market that they are located in. For McDonald's, when they first got started, their domestic market was the United States. But once they wanted to grow, they needed to move into a foreign market, So a foreign market will be something like McDonald's launching in India, some place where they'll have to make some adjustments to their marketing in order to succeed. So here's an example. There's buses. Ballard Power Systems, sells fuel cell buses, but there's only so many transportation companies, bus companies in Canada. To grow further, they needed to partner with China, with all those cities, all those industrializations. It's a great market to access. So they have a local partner and they sell their fuel cells in China. Wages are lower in other parts of the world, so more profit for the business. Unfortunately, it's a very cynical reason for why we do this, why there's international business. So, here you can see how manufacturing is shifting towards Mexico because it's one of the countries in the world that has lower wages. So here's the wages per hour in 2000, 2005, all the way to 2015. So wages in China are going up, but Mexico, the green column, is not. So some companies are moving their production to Mexico to take advantage of that. There's increased quality of the goods, just new workers, new technology, new methods can do things a little higher quality. So, Google, when they launched their Pixel phone, they partnered with HTC in Taiwan. They could have opened up their own factory and done it themselves, but they'd have to do trial and error. They'd have to figure it out. They'd have to buy all of the machinery. By partnering with HTC, they know that they're going to get a reliable level of quality. Quantity of goods, if it can be made cheaply, it can be sold in large numbers. And again, the more you make of something, the lower the cost is usually, and that's just known as the economy of scale. So, Hyundai, started in South Korea, and then they went to China and the United States, and it allowed them to sell more and more cars, which made more and more profits for them. And I skipped some of these because I don't want to take too much of your time. You can go back and go through this. So access to resources, maybe there's an agricultural commodity, a mining commodity, skilled labor, money, capital, maybe a company needs to partner with an investor in another part of the world. Those are other reasons you would go internationally. So Tata Steel is partnering with some mining operations in Quebec and Newfoundland to extract ore, which it then uses to make its own steel. So even though it's an Indian steel company, here's one of their production facilities in northern Quebec, and they're doing that for the access to resources because some things are only available in certain parts of the world. So another term, you might understand that there's certain products you recognize, from around the world. They're called global products. That is, something that is offered, in the same product, the same packaging, almost the same logo. It's something that you can see around the world that's very standard. For an example of that would be Coke. So Coke, you can see a can of Coke, a bottle of Coke anywhere in the world, and it's going to be something that's standardized throughout the world, and we would call that a global product. So that's just another term. You can, so you could be a successful Canadian company, but until you expand internationally and succeed overseas, you don't have a global product just yet. So a domestic transaction, if you sell items that are produced in the same country, Canada Goose, when they sell it at Yorkdale, it's a domestic transaction. A Canadian company, it's made, in Canada, selling it to Canadians is a domestic transaction. And then the other one is an international or a foreign transaction. For example, when, you know, Jordan brand sells their products overseas in Asia, in Japan, that is, an international transaction or a foreign transaction because it's crossing lines, crossing borders. So that's sort of the main takeaways, is why companies would do business overseas. Do you guys have any questions about why a country might do any international business? As a teacher, it is a bit hard when I don't see you, so I assume everything's okay. No one's typed anything in the chat. Um, so we're going to assume that things are good, but if you have questions, stay in the chat until the end. Or type. Okay, so I had a question. What's the difference between raw materials and natural resources? So the natural resources are anything that's coming out of the earth. So for when we go back to that slide where Tata Steel was opening in Quebec. Sorry, I'm going to go back to that slide. Just going to share my screen. Okay, so if we're thinking of what's a natural resource, so we're here in this mining area, they're digging up the ground and they're taking the ore out of the ground. That would be like a natural resource. And then that becomes the raw material that's made into steel. So but it might have to be, processed a little bit. This, I'm not an expert on how to make steel. Let's say the ore that comes out of this needs to be sort of melted down and processed a little bit before it ships to the steel factory. Like that's kind of, they're very, very close, but it's just raw materials are like the ingredients. So, if we were making bread, the wheat is like the natural resource that came out of the ground, but then it has to be ground into flour, which is like a raw material for the cake or the bread. Like, so for this steel company here in Quebec, they're excavating something that's the natural resource, the ore that's coming out of the ground, and that could go to the factory to be made into steel right away, or it might need to be processed into another grade of metal before it is made into steel. But either way, it's kind of a raw material that's, goes into steel. So if you can think of it as an example of natural resources come out of the ground and raw material is the ingredient for any recipe. If that makes sense, I hope that sort of clears things up. So how can we sort of put our ideas together? Well, here's sort of today's little activity. So if you go to international business, you can see there is, to find an advertisement between Canada and another country and sort of explain how things are a little bit different. So when you're doing that, try to go back, remember your 4 Ps from the marketing mix, and describe that. So here I found some advertisements for McDonald's in Canada and Bangladesh. So over the winter, McDonald's was doing this, is a Big Mac, still a Big Mac with bacon. And in Bangladesh last year, they were doing sort of a Ramadan meal, an iftar meal, where they were selling it at sundown and encouraging people to break their fast there. So one of the things, some of the differences would be, in modifying the menu, right? Like you see, here's the Big Mac, and then we have some chicken sandwiches here. There's still the fries, but if you look closely, these are actually dates. So they've modified their product to include dates as an adjustment. They've as a promotion, they extend their hours to encourage people to break their fast there. In Canada, their promotion was to, have a social media campaign. So if you wanted to find a company of your own choice, one of those um, global brands, you could look at how it works in Canada, how it's presenting itself in Canada, and then another country. And in the like, you don't need to write a lot, but if you do see here, I'm trying to use as many terms from the class as possible. I talk about the demographics. I try to talk about their brand identification. Still using the red and yellow no matter what. Talking about the who's it targeted for. So in Canada, that ad might have been targeted for one person to come, as an impulse purchase. Hey, if you like bacon, come and get a sandwich. Whereas it's targeted, the size of the meal in Bangladesh is targeted for more of a family size. So it's slightly different target audience. And so that you don't need to write a lot, but try to use as much of the terms from the course as you can, because that's sort of a key thing, is showing your understanding, but then also using the terms that you can. So for today, that's sort of all my thoughts, to sort of just introduce you to international business. And then there's a little task you can work on that'll take you, another 15 minutes today and another 15 minutes on Friday to get done. And our next class is going to be, Friday at 10 a.m. Do you guys have any questions? You can also use the thumbs up button, just to, in the bottom right, just to indicate things are good too. It would make me feel more reassured. So if I don't, I guess I can say you're dismissed. If you want to stay, okay, thank you for MS and AS for showing me that. If you want to stay for extra questions, go ahead. If not, please go and enjoy your day. Try to find those 2 advertisements and compare them, and we'll see you again Friday at 10. Okay, so thanks, Ella and Ted. I'll see you later.